Hi guys, this is the Mushroom Wizard here, and I have put together a series of slideshows, and I'll be talking over top of each of these slideshows. These slideshows are about picking mushrooms in Saskatchewan. So I hope you enjoy what I have to offer here. The first one is called Mushroom Terminology. Now, why do we need to start with a slideshow on proper terminology? It's because for every part of the mushroom and for every aspect of the mushroom that we use to ID mushrooms, there's going to be 4 or 5 separate names that you can find to describe it. Some of them will be scientific names, some of them will be common names, some of them are kind of a hybrid between the two. But if we're always using different names to describe the same thing, it's going to get very confusing. So without further ado, this is mushroom terminology. What is a mushroom? A mushroom is the common name for the fruiting body of a fungus. That fungus is usually underground or buried within a piece of dead wood or a tree, whatever it may be. But the fungus is not the mushroom. The mushroom is simply one part of the fungus. Moving on. So to get started here, we're going to talk about different mushroom types, because there are more than just the basic agaric mushroom type that we're all familiar with. And those would include agarics, which are gilled mushrooms, bulletes, toothed mushrooms, asci mushrooms, ridged mushrooms, mushrooms that look like deep sea coral, puffballs, polypores, jelly mushrooms, and finely cup mushrooms. I'll try to go through this quickly so I don't keep you all night here. Agaric mushrooms, like I said, this is the common mushroom type that we're all familiar with. It has a cap up top. It has a stipe or a stem holding that cap up. And then underneath the cap are gills. And the gills are a separate component of the mushroom. And they're basically plates kind of pushed together, ringing that mushroom, and that is where the spores are produced, is in between those gills. Bulletes. So a bullete shares the same basic structure superficially. It has that stipe or stalk that's holding up a cap, but underneath that cap, you're going to find a fleshy sort of porous sponge-like surface, and on that surface you're going to see pores, little holes, and the spores develop inside and drop down through little tubes and out the pores. And those are very common in Saskatchewan as well, so pay attention to that one. Toothed mushrooms, again, usually share the same agaric structure of a stipe holding up a cap, but underneath that cap you can see what are called teeth hanging down. They actually look like little spines, and the spores are produced along the length of those spines, and then they drop down from the spine tips. And not all toothed mushrooms share the agaric shape of a stipe holding up a cap. You're going to see some that attach to wood when we get to the toothed mushroom section later on that look very different. Asci. So asci means sac. And sac mushrooms would include things like morels, the gyromitras, elephant saddles, stuff like that. And on top of the stipe there, you don't see a cap. What you see is kind of like a wrinkled sac. And the spores are produced within pits or folds on the surface of that asci. Ridged. So the most common being chanterelles, but there are other species as well that occur in Saskatchewan. And ridges look an awful lot like gills, but they're not gills. They're not a separate structure that's attached underneath the cap. They are just the flesh itself kind of creating ridges as it goes, and the spores are generated upon those ridges. Coral mushrooms. So a coral mushroom is one that has branches, either a single branch, such as in club corals, or multiple branches coming from kind of like a single bottom basal branch. And often they fork out into other branches. They resemble deep sea corals often, or else they'll just look completely bizarre. They are quite beautiful, and they form their spores along the branches, just along the edges there. Puffballs. Anybody who's done any mushroom picking is likely familiar with puffballs already. So puffballs have a skin, an outer skin, and no gills, no opening of any kind, and inside they have a solid white mass called a gleba. And the gleba develops into spores, like a large spore deposit that is internal. And at the end of the life of the puffball, it will develop a large pore on the top that's like an opening, and some sort of agitation, like something kicking the puffball or wind or rain hitting it, will cause it to puff. And all those dried spores inside will come shooting out in a big puff. Polypores. So polypores can take on many different shapes. On the left, we have what I would call a conch. It is a hoof-shaped structure that attaches directly to wood. Next to it, we have kind of this sort of bracket shape. They're flat, they're thin fungi, and they often form like a shelving cluster or a rosette structure like you're seeing there. And then on the far right there, you see what I would call a frond structure, where it's more fleshy, thicker, creating like a big mass, almost like a rosette-shaped mass. Often, polypores will appear to be terrestrial on the ground, but they are still attached to wood. They'll just be attached to buried wood. So these are usually parasitic or saprobic in nature. We'll get more into that later on. But most importantly, most of them have pores on the bottom. And they are not like the boletes in the sense they don't have an agaric shape. They don't have a stipe and a cap that's fleshy growing up from the ground. Jelly fungi are extremely beautiful. We do eat them. Some people do eat them. I eat them. They go well in soup. They're very good for kids, getting kids into picking mushroom, I find, because they're so easy to identify and they're very colorful. Jelly fungi have various structures that produce spores. Often they're different from one another. They have this kind of like gummy worm feel, or they'll be very slimy. They just obviously look like jelly or jelly-ish. Cup fungi. We don't see many of those in mushroom picking. There are a few, such as the one pictured here, which is an orange peel fungus. They form a cup. Rain fills that cup, and the spores are kind of in the interior surface there, and they are caught in the rain. And as the cup fills with water, the water pours over and distributes the spores in that manner. Moving on, we're going to talk about the anatomy of a mushroom. We're going to call a cap a cap. We're not going to get more scientific than that, because why bother? We all know what we're talking about. On the cap, you're going to find various structures, usually small structures. Some of them will be hair-like, some of them will just be upraised. We're going to call those, for the most part, scales or patches. We'll get more into that here in a bit. On the bottom, gills. That'll be the most common method of spore dispersion that we'll see. There will also, like we just went over, there will also be pores and teeth and whatnot. We're going to see something that holds up the cap that can be called a stem or a stalk, but I prefer to call it a stipe, because stipe is unique to mushrooms. And one of the aspects that I will be using to describe a stipe when we get into different species is to say that it is stalk-like or stem-like, almost like a plant, or like, say, a dandelion. So we're going to call them a stipe. Call a stipe. And then what you're going to see is these kind of flesh-like components to the mushroom here. One is a vulva, which is basically a cup from the bottom that is flesh-like. And then the other is an annulus. It doesn't say annulus there, but that's the word I'm going to use. And the reason is, when you're describing the different types of annulus, you can say it's skirt-like or pendant or a ring zone. So just to make it easy, you're just going to call an annulus an annulus. And then at the bottom there, we have mycelial threads that reach down, and they're reaching down to the actual fungus. Because like I mentioned before, the mushroom is like an apple. Underneath the ground or within the tree or the wood or whatever it's eating, you're going to have the actual fungus, which is more like a tree. Doesn't look like a tree, but consider it like the tree, and the mushroom, the apple. And it's those mycelial threads that reach down and connect to the fungus itself. Cap shapes, we'll go over these quickly. Convex, that's your basic cap shape there that we're going to see with so many of the agaric mushrooms and the boletes. Hemispherical, I'm not going to use that. Hemispherical to me is just bigger convex, so we'll just leave that alone. Spherical, often mushrooms start out their life spherical, so I will use that a couple times, but that's basically where the outer margin of that cap is downturned, so much so that it protects the gills and is attached to the stipe. And often it will open up as it grows. Ovoid mushrooms, we're going to see a couple of those. Conical mushrooms. Conical mushrooms are mushrooms that look like an upside down ice cream cone. Cylindric mushrooms, we will see one or two of those. Flat mushrooms, we're going to see a lot of mushrooms that become flat. Not usually at the beginning, but later on in life. They'll start out convex and they'll flatten as they age. Depressed, often mushrooms, again, later in life will end up depressed. They'll go from a convex to a depressed state where it has like that dip in the middle. If it's really exaggerated, it will become funnel shaped. That looks almost like a vase or a funnel. Funnel mushrooms are probably the best example, obviously, of the funnel shape. Campanulate, we're going to see a couple of those. Umbonate and umbilicate, we will see those as well. Uplifted, I'm not going to use because that's just depressed to me. That's just the same thing. Interchangeable. So umbilicate is where you have that depression in the middle, but you have a little hump coming up as well. So it's both depressed and raised. And that hump is called an umbo. And then umbonate is where you don't have the depression. It just is basically convex, but at the top it's got almost like a little nipple at the top there. Gill attachments to the stipe are very important when it comes to determining what type of mushroom you are looking at. So we'll go through them quickly here, and everything that I'm talking about we're going to go over again, over and over again, when we're actually looking at different mushroom species. So first, we have mushrooms that are free from the stipe. The gills do not reach the stipe. They reach over and then they stop, and then there's kind of like, when you're looking at them from above, you'll see a ring around the stipe that is just kind of flesh. Adnext mushrooms are mushrooms that reach over to the stipe, and then they start to descend inwards there. They start to reach inwards, and there's just a tiny little attachment. So it looks almost like a little bit of a rim around that stipe. Adnate mushrooms, adnate connections are when those gills just reach across and touch the stipe. And that's a very common one. Notched mushrooms are when they're adnate, they reach across, touch the stipe, but there's a channel, almost like it's been dug in this more towards the center of the gills there. Decurrent mushrooms are very common. We're going to see a lot of decurrent. gill attachments, and that's where the gills are just running down the stipe. Sometimes they'll go almost right to the bottom, sometimes just a short ways, but it's a way that we can tell one mushroom from another. Gill spacing. So when you're looking down at those gills, you're going to notice various amounts of space between each gill from one species to another. Distant, very obvious what it's talking about. When you take a look at a mushroom that is distant and a mushroom that is crowded, it's a pretty big difference. It'll be very noticeable. And then subdistant and close. As we go through them, it'll become more obvious which is which. So the stipe and how it attaches to the cap. I have 4 types here that are going to be found in Saskatchewan mushrooms. One is central. It's just basically like an umbrella. It's going up to the top, attaching right in the central area. Eccentric is where it's off-center, or it's just kind of weird. It's got this weird attachment to the stipe that is not what you would expect. A lateral attachment, often you find that in mushrooms that are growing off of wood, and that's where it's attaching to the cap sideways. Sorry, I just need to take a little drink there. And then finally, we have no attachment to the stipe, because there is no stipe, and that's a sessile attachment, where it's just basically attached directly to wood. And the shapes of the stipe are going to be important as well. So first off, cylindrical. Cylindrical is just basically equal width the whole way down the stipe. Very obvious. You're going to see a lot of those. Clavate is where you have a tapering stipe that tapers towards the base, towards the apex, and then it becomes more bulbous towards the base. Rooting is where you have a stipe that is widest at the apex, at the top there, and then it tapers towards the base. So it looks kind of like a carrot. Fusiform is where you have the widest portion of the stipe right in the center, and then it's tapering on either end. And then bulbous is where you have a cylindrical stipe, just like the first one, and it's the same width the whole way through, and then at the very bottom there's a bulb on the end, kind of like a little ball. Cap margins. So a margin is the area around the outer rim of the cap. And this is very important, again, for identifying mushrooms if you want to do it right. And I suggest you do it right because you don't want to die. So a smooth cap margin is just basically nothing there. It's just a smooth, sort of round exterior. Striate is where you have lines or grooves around the margin of the cap. Undulating is where those margins turn up. Often mushrooms that are smooth early in life become wavy or undulating later on. I'll usually say wavy because it's just easier to describe. And it's almost like a wave going around the edge. Scalloped is basically that. It's got like little notches that have been cut into the margin as opposed to the striated lines. Hairy or tomentose is where there are kind of like sort of hairy fibers around the outer edge, or almost like wool, or cortina fragments. We'll get into that in a second here too. Appendiculate is where a partial veil has left flesh-like fragments that hang down from the edges. We're going to see a fair amount of those too. And those are left over from a partial veil. Split is where you would have had those striate lines, and then as it expands, it splits apart. We see a couple of those. And then the pleats, there's only 1 or 2 mushrooms that we're going to talk about that have pleats, and that's basically folds, sort of like an umbrella that's not opened yet. Cap cuticles. We'll quickly go through this. So cap cuticles, a cap cuticle is the outer surface of the cap. It's something that you can often peel away to see the flesh underneath. And there are different aspects of the cuticle that are important for determining what mushroom is what. So a smooth cap cuticle is exactly that. It's just your basic smooth mushroom. Think button mushroom, white button mushroom. It's just smooth, nothing really of note. Velvety is where you have a whole bunch of oppressed hair-like fibers that are very short, and it creates kind of like a textural feel to the top of the mushroom that is similar to velvet. Hairy or fibrulose is when those oppressed fibers are not short, where they're longer, so it has a sort of hairy or kind of shaggy feel to it. Raised scales, I mean, the scales are the little tiny upraised portions on the top there. It's rough. You run your hands over it, and they do look like scales. The flat scales are ones that just simply aren't upraised. It doesn't feel rough, but you can still see those same scales there. Patches are leftover fragments from a veil, from a partial veil. We'll get into that in a bit. From a universal veil, sorry. But yeah, they're flesh-like. They're just kind of leftover material from when this mushroom was very young, are just left on the top of the mushroom. Pruinose is where the mushroom has kind of like a bloom of white dust on it. Uneven, obvious what that is. You can tell right from the picture. It's just kind of like a lumpy mess. Wrinkled. Again, the cap is taken on a wrinkled quality. This scurfy, branny, whatever, I'm not going to bother with that, because to me that's either pruinose or raised scales or a combination of the two, so why complicate it? Zonate is when you have concentric bands, usually of color, sometimes they're a little bit upraised, ringing the top of the cap there, usually from the center outward. And then finally, areolate. The best way to describe that is if you see like a mud puddle and it's a hot, dry day out and the mud dries and cracks. That's an areolate sort of surface that you would be looking at. Annulus types. Okay. So an annulus is basically the ring of the mushroom. It's a leftover component of what's called a partial veil or a universal veil that was used to cover the gills when young. And it's ripped away from the cap. And there are different types here that we can look at. One is called pendant, the first one there. And pendant annulus is the skirt-like annulus that we referred to earlier. And it's just hanging down kind of like a skirt. Flaring is where the annulus basically flares outwards, it juts outwards. Sheathing is where it sheaths the bottom, comes up, and instead of hanging down, it's actually going upwards. A double is just another type of sheathing. It's a double-lipped sheathing there, so we will see other double-lipped rings as well. Cobwebby, I'm not going to say cobwebby, I'm going to say it's a courtena. A courtena is where you had these kind of like web-like, wispy sort of threads connecting the stipe to the cap margin, and they were protecting the gills as a result. And then when those rip apart, you get what is basically a ring zone, which you can see to the right of that. And the ring zone, instead of just being a ring zone, will have fragments of this web-like wispy threads hanging down. And then the ring zone is where you don't actually have an annulus, so to say, other than it is a color difference or a slight texture difference that we're talking about. And then these are the veils. So the veils are what create the annulus that we just looked at. So the different type of veils, the most common we're going to see is called a partial veil. That is where you have like this fleshy sort of covering over top of the gills. in a young mushroom, and they protect the gills while they're developing. A cortina, which is next to it, is these kind of web-like, thready sort of fragments that create a sort of web-like veil, a cortina veil. And next to it, we have a universal veil. So a universal veil is a veil that covers the entire mushroom, almost like an egg. And then finally, we have a slime veil. So a slime veil is basically that. It's sort of this mucousy, sort of slimy coating that keeps the gills protected. Short gills. Briefly go over this. Short gills are gills that are not fully reaching from the cap margin to the stipe. We're going to have three different occurrences of short gills. We're going to have absent short gills, which you see on the left. There's nothing there. It's just full-on gills. They're going from the margin to the stipe, each and every one. Next to it, I would call that short gills present. Short gills present means there are 1 to 2 gills maybe between each full gill. And you can see there, if you look real closely, some of those gills do not reach the full length. But there are more gills than short gills. And then short gills frequent, that is what you're seeing on the right there. There's a whole lot more short gills than gills. You can see in one spot there, there's actually 4 short gills between 2 regular gills. Quickly going to go through the ecology types here. So saprobic, that's a mushroom that feeds upon decaying organic material. Some you'll see in grass, and they're basically feeding upon decaying grass roots that have died, or other organic material that is dead in the soil. Or else it'll attach directly to wood that has died, like an oyster mushroom does. Mycorrhizal mushrooms are mushrooms that are a bit more complicated in their relationship and the way in which they get food. How a mycorrhizal mushroom works is that it is basically associated with a tree or a plant, and it grows alongside that tree, and it is basically, the fungus itself is underground and it's wrapped around the tree roots, and as the tree grows, it gives nutrients to the mushroom, and the mushroom breaks down nutrients in the soil for the tree. So it's mutually beneficial, and often the mushroom will be present for the entire life of the tree. Not the mushroom itself, but the fungus that creates the mushrooms. And you will find these mushrooms under a specific tree usually. Like if you have a species that is mycorrhizal with birch, it will only ever grow under birch trees. And that will actually help you to hunt mushrooms as opposed to just finding them willy-nilly wherever they may be, because you'll know what trees to target. Parasitic mushrooms are mushrooms that attack a living host. They're not growing on dead trees or dead plants. They're growing on living plants or on other mushrooms. And they are not beneficial to the host. They are killing the host, often slowly, but surely. Ecology also includes the ways in which mushrooms are grouped and the ways in which they are arranged in terms of other members of its own species. So a solitary mushroom is a mushroom that occurs, but there are no other members of its species. It's only the fungus is only producing one fruiting body at a time. Scattered mushrooms is when that fungus is producing a scattering. There are several mushrooms, but they're not close together. Gregarious, again, that's where you're going to have a whole field of mushrooms from a gregarious species. And often, well, not often, but sometimes you're going to see some species that we'll talk about that have, say, hundreds of fruiting bodies that come up. Clusters are mushrooms that occur in dense bunches. So they're gregarious, but they're all clustered together in a big clump. And sometimes they'll form like a single solid basal mass, and all the different fruiting bodies will be connected together. Rings are mushrooms that grow in the famous classic fairy ring. Often these are better described as arcs because the rings often aren't fully formed. Sometimes they are, but usually you'll just see kind of like a semicircle. And finally, we're going to go over a few brief terms here. I'll actually just describe them as we go. Hygrophanous. Hygrophanous is when you have a mushroom that is a very different color when it's dried than as opposed to when it's moist. So hygrophanous mushrooms often, as a result, while they're drying out, gain a two-toned appearance. So this mushroom here that we're looking here, this cap, when it's fully dried, it'll be white. But if you add water to it, it'll suddenly be brown again. So that's a hygrophanous mushroom. It means water-loving. Latex. Latex is a liquid that milk caps, and that's a type of mushroom that we'll talk about later, but it's a liquid that milk caps secrete when their gills are damaged. In Saskatchewan, all the species, I believe, have white latex. But sometimes that latex, that white kind of milky liquid, will change color once exposed to oxygen. And that's a way of telling different milk caps apart. Reticulate is a pattern over top of a stipe that is net-like. It basically looks like netting over top of a background. Scaber. We see these in scaber stalk mushrooms and a few others. That's basically just that very dense scaling that's upraised that you can see there, that's running up the cap. Gives a very rough appearance. Fibrous. So a stipe that is fibrous is a stipe that is made up of longitudinally compressed strings or fibers, as you can see there. You can pull it apart like string cheese. Often these are very tough stipes. Smooth, we've already talked about that. Moving on. Umbo is that raised bump in the middle there. You can see it up close. Viscid is a cap coating of slime. I would describe that as viscid. And often that'll be there throughout the mushroom's life. It just generates this kind of like mucousy slime. And people do pick these, like I said. Deliquesce. When something goes through deliquescence or becomes deliquescent, that's when the gills, as a part of their natural life cycle, begin to digest themselves. They auto-digest. And in the process of that digestion, which is usually very rapid, the mushroom becomes black, inky goo. And that's something that we see in shaggy manes and inky caps and other coprinoid mushrooms. And we'll talk about that. There will be a section on that. And that is it. I hope you enjoyed this very first video from me, the Mushroom Wizard, as I call myself, because I like wizards and I like mushrooms. I'm not actually a wizard or a mushroom. And I hope you will watch the ones that come out next. Thank you.